A handprint is often the first thing you see when torchlight hits the wall. 30,000 years ago, someone pressed their palm against stone and blew ochre across it, leaving a negative outline. Fragile, but unmistakably deliberate, a signature with no name attached to it. Look past the handprints, though. Past the horses and bison and mammoths that seem to move across the rock in the flickering light, and something stranger comes into view. When Paleolithic people finally did draw themselves, they almost never drew hunters, families, or portraits. The handful of human figures that do survive are unsettling in ways researchers still cannot fully agree on, even now. For people who could paint a bison's muscle and shading with startling precision, the human form shows up rarely, and every time it does, it leaves the people studying it with more questions than answers. To understand why, the story has to start long before Lascaux or Chauvet, on the southern tip of Africa at Blombos Cave. In 2002, a team led by archaeologist Christopher Henshelwood published a discovery in the journal Science: 2 pieces of ochre, engraved with a deliberate cross-hatched pattern, dated to roughly 75,000 to 77,000 years old. It remains one of the earliest confirmed examples of intentional symbolic marking anywhere in the human record. A separate find at the same site, a cross-hatched pattern made with an actual ochre crayon on a stone flake and dated to about 73,000 years old, is the piece more properly credited as the oldest known drawing. Both finds came from layers that also produced perforated shell beads and abalone shells, still holding traces of a prepared ochre mixture. Some of it dated back 100,000 years, along with a grinding stone and animal bone, apparently used to work fat into the pigment. That combination points to something more deliberate than a lucky scratch on a rock. It looks like an actual toolkit, assembled, used, and presumably passed down, for making color and applying it to something. Real evidence of planning, mixing, and deliberate symbolic behavior. And yet even here, none of it was a human body. No face, no figure. Just lines. The pattern holds even outside our own species. In Spain, at 3 caves called La Pasiega, Maltravieso, and Ardales, researchers led by Dirk Hoffman used uranium-thorium dating on the mineral crusts that had formed over red pigment markings, ladder shapes, dots, and a hand stencil. Published in Science in 2018, the results put the paintings at a minimum of 64,800 years old, more than 20,000 years before modern humans ever set foot in Europe. That timing points to one conclusion: Neanderthals made this art. This dating has not gone unchallenged. A 2019 rebuttal argued the uranium-thorium results might be inflated by mineral leaching in the specific samples used, which would make the art younger and its authorship uncertain again. The debate has not been fully settled either way. What both sides agree on is that whoever made these marks left hands and abstract shapes on the wall, and nothing resembling a full human figure. By the time modern humans reached Southeast Asia, the same pattern holds. On the island of Sulawesi, a Sulawesi warty pig painted alongside hand stencils at a site called Liang Tedonge has been dated to at least 45,500 years old, making it, at the time it was published, the oldest known figurative artwork anywhere in the world. Nearby, at a cave called Liang Bulu Sipong 4, researchers dated a different scene to at least 43,900 years old, a hunting party chasing wild pigs and dwarf buffalo. This one is worth pausing on, because it is one of the rare moments in Paleolithic art where humans are shown doing something active rather than dying, except they are not shown as humans at all. The hunters are therianthropes, bodies with animal heads, part person and part beast. Even in the one scene built around human triumph instead of human suffering, the artists still could not bring themselves to paint an actual person. Finally, around 45,000 years ago, modern humans reached Ice Age Europe and filled its caves with animals rendered in extraordinary detail: the lions of Chauvet, the bison of Altamira, the horses of Lascaux, painted with a level of skill that nothing else would match until the Renaissance. Across all of it, the pattern never breaks. Thousands of animals, dozens of abstract signs, countless handprints, almost no humans. From Africa to Europe to Southeast Asia, across 2 different human species and more than 60,000 years, the one consistent gap is the human self. The skill was clearly there, visible in every confident line of ochre and charcoal, which means the silence was deliberate. And deliberate silences are exactly the kind of thing archaeologists have spent decades trying, and largely failing, to fully explain. Archaeologists have spent those decades testing the obvious answers, and the leading explanations keep running into the same wall. The first is simple. Maybe Paleolithic artists lacked the technical skill to draw people. That idea collapses the moment you actually look at the animals. The lions at Chauvet are muscular and caught mid-motion. The bison at Altamira swell with volume and shading. The herds at Lascaux move with something close to cinematic energy. These were not artists working at the edge of their ability. If they could render a mammoth's eye or a lion's mane with that kind of precision, they could have rendered their own faces just as easily. The second explanation is taboo, the idea that depicting the human body was spiritually forbidden. This has some real anthropological grounding. Some communities today do treat images of the human form with caution, and even industrial-era Europe carried its own superstitions, linking a person's portrait to their soul, the kind of belief that shows up in stories like The Picture of Dorian Gray. But a strict taboo does not fit the evidence either. Human figures do appear in Paleolithic caves, rarely and never neutrally, but they appear. A total prohibition would not allow for that at all. The third, and most popular explanation is shamanism. Archaeologists Jean Klotz and David Lewis Williams developed this idea most fully in their 1998 book, The Shamans of Prehistory, arguing that sensations reported in trance states, flying, being pierced, merging with an animal, could explain the hybrids and wounded figures on cave walls. For some images, this fits well, and echoes patterns documented in modern trance ethnography. But Lewis Williams himself later acknowledged, in his 2002 book The Mind in the Cave, that shamanism alone cannot explain everything. It does not account for why the victims in these scenes are always victims and never aggressors. It does not explain the bound, restrained figures found at Adara in Sicily. It does not explain why, across cultures, continents, and species, the human figure is not just rare, but specifically tied to death, violence, or distortion. There is a fourth explanation worth adding to this list, one older than any of the other three, and largely left out of how this mystery usually gets framed. Early 20th century archaeologist Henri Breuil proposed that cave art functioned as hunting magic, a kind of ritual meant to secure success before a hunt actually happened. The idea being that painting a successful kill in advance somehow helped bring one about. For decades, this was the default academic position on why animals dominate the walls at all, taught as settled fact long before anyone seriously tested it against the full range of evidence. But it runs into the same problem as the other three. Hunting magic might explain why animals are painted so obsessively, over and over, generation after generation. It does not explain why humans, on the rare occasions they do appear, show up wounded, hybridized, or dead, rather than as the confident hunters the ritual would presumably be honoring. None of the four explanations get all the way there on their own, and testing them one by one leaves something behind that none of them account for: the silence itself, and the fact that whenever it breaks towards something unsettling. At Pec Merle in France, the cave welcomes you first. Horses painted with a spotted coat pattern so precise that a 2011 genetic study confirmed Ice Age horses did carry that exact dappled coloring. Hands bloom across the stone in ochre. It feels, for a while, like a record of simply being alive. Deeper into the chamber, that shifts. Etched in rough black lines is a crude, almost stick-like human figure, pierced through the torso by what looks like 5 or 10 separate spears. Beside it sits a bold, geometric sign researchers call an aviform, a shape that recurs at other sites in the region and may have marked group identity. Together, the figure and the sign read less like a drawing and more like a warning left for whoever came next. Deeper still, in the caves of Cugnac, the same descent happens again. Elegant deer and ibex give way to two human figures. One is folded into the outline of a giant deer, its back pierced with spears. The other lies flat, arms and legs spread, riddled with wounds. Archaeologist Michel Lorblanchet, who studied the site for decades, argued the placement of these projectile marks was deliberate rather than random. Staged violence meant to be remembered rather than simply recorded. At Lascaux, the descent becomes total. The cave was discovered by accident in 1940. when a group of teenagers followed their dog into a hole in the ground near the village of Montignac and found themselves standing inside one of the most complete painted spaces ever recorded. The cave holds more than 600 painted animals, horses, bison, and stags, rendered with a fluency that would not be matched again for tens of thousands of years. It was closed to the public in 1963, specifically to protect that fragility, after years of visitor breath and artificial light had started damaging the pigments. And in the entire cave, there is exactly one human figure, hidden in a shaft reachable only by rope, far from the main galleries everyone actually sees. It shows a bison, gutted, its entrails spilling in vivid red, and in front of it a stiff, lifeless man with a bird-like head, arms flung wide, a clear sign of arousal, a bird-top staff resting beside him. A 2024 study found the entrails were rendered with real anatomical accuracy, suggesting the artist had witnessed a scene like this firsthand. Whatever it actually depicts, a failed hunt, a shaman's vision, or something else entirely, it remains the only human-like figure in one of the most celebrated painted spaces on Earth, and it is buried in the dark. The pattern continues outward. At Trois Frères, faint engravings show a crouching, antlered figure, limbs bent as though mid-dance, nicknamed the Sorcerer, since it was first sketched by the archaeologist Henri Breuil. At Gabillou, another hybrid figure twists in what looks like pain, bison horns rising from its head. Klotz and Lewis Williams read these as evidence of shamanic trance, artists caught mid-transformation between human and animal. They could just as easily be characters from myths that no longer survive in any other form, stories that once needed no explanation because everyone looking at the wall already knew them. At Cosquer, a cave whose entrance now sits underwater in the Mediterranean, reachable today only by divers, horses, ibex, and seals cover the walls, and among them is a crude, seal-headed human figure nicknamed the Killed Man, pierced and shown falling. And at Adara in Sicily, more human figures appear than at almost any other Paleolithic site, dozens of them, but not hunting or celebrating. At the center, two lie bound, arms pressed to their sides, surrounded by others gesturing around them. Some researchers read this as ritual, others read it as something closer to sacrifice. Either way, it is not a peaceful scene. By the time you step back out into daylight, the pattern is impossible to unsee. Animals fill these caves alive and enduring. Humans are rare, and when they do appear, it is always at the edge of something, pierced, bound, hybridized, or falling. These caves never once show us as hunters, storytellers, or families. They show us as fragile bodies, caught mid-collapse. To make sense of any of this, it helps to step back and look at the numbers behind Ice Age Europe. It is tempting to picture a landscape crowded with rival clans fighting over caves and territory. The population data tells a very different story. Estimates first proposed by researchers Chris Stringer and Clive Gamble suggest the entire population of Europe during the height of the Upper Paleolithic, around 37,000 years ago, may have numbered only in the low thousands, spread across an entire continent. That figure has not been independently reconfirmed here and should be treated as an order of magnitude rather than an exact count, but it lines up with other research suggesting bands of only 20 to 30 people at a time, and a global Homo sapiens population that stayed well under 50,000 for long stretches of prehistory. In groups that small, violence was not constant, but when it happened, the consequences rippled through the entire group, rather than staying contained to whoever was directly involved. For years, popular culture leaned on the idea of the peaceful forager, communities living in harmony with nature and each other before the corruption of settled civilization supposedly arrived. The actual research complicates that picture rather than confirming it. In 2013, anthropologists Douglas Fry and Patrick Soderberg published an analysis in Science covering 21 mobile forager societies, and found that most lethal violence in these groups came from personal disputes, family conflict, and one-on-one killings, not organized warfare between rival bands. That finding has not gone unchallenged. Economist Samuel Bowles and others have argued the study understates real levels of intergroup violence and misreads parts of the ethnographic record it draws from, and the disagreement between the two camps is still active as of recent published exchanges. Meanwhile, archaeologist Lawrence Keeley, in his 1996 book War Before Civilization, pointed to direct skeletal evidence of prehistoric violence. The Kennewick man skeleton, found with a projectile point lodged in its pelvis, and the Jebel Sahaba cemetery in Sudan, where roughly 40% of the buried individuals show trauma from arrows and spears. Anthropologist Raymond Kelly later proposed a useful distinction between simple, highly mobile foraging bands, where violence tended to stay personal and episodic, and larger, more settled complex foraging societies, where organized raiding became more common once groups had stored food, fixed territory, and larger populations worth fighting over. Upper Paleolithic Europe, small, scattered, and constantly moving, looks much closer to the first category than the second, which helps explain why the archaeological signature of large-scale organized violence, mass graves, fortifications, weapons built specifically for war rather than the hunt, does not show up in Europe until thousands of years later, once people had settled down and had something fixed worth defending. Put together, what the evidence actually shows is that violence was never absent from human history. It simply looked different than the wars that came later. It looked like quarrels between brothers, disputes between neighbors, the kind of conflict that seems small until you remember the scale of the group it happened inside. In a band of 20 or 30 people, a single death was not a statistic. It could break a hunting party, end a family line, or split a group in two. That kind of intimacy gave violence a weight it rarely carries in a species of 8 billion. It got remembered, it got retold, and maybe, on occasion, it got painted. The speared figures at Pech Merle and Cugnac, the bird-headed man at Lascaux, the bound bodies at Adara. These may not be simple illustrations. They may be warnings, or lessons, or fragments of stories that once carried real weight in oral memory, given permanent form on stone. Animals on these walls return every season, the same herds, the same migrations, over and over. Humans do not get that guarantee. One spear, one dispute, one bad winter, and everything a small group had built could come apart. The caves did not paint us as heroes, because for the people painting them, being human simply felt breakable. So what does it actually add up to? None of the four explanations get there on their own. The skill was clearly present. The taboo was never absolute. Shamanism explains some of the imagery, but not the consistent violence. Hunting magic explains the animals, but not the silence surrounding us. The strongest current reading treats the silence itself as meaningful, not quite proof, but the closest thing researchers currently have to an actual answer. Archaeologist David Lewis Williams has argued that caves functioned as thresholds, spaces where people confronted forces larger than themselves, and that drawing a human figure in that kind of space meant admitting the human form was fragile in a way an animal herd simply was not. Herds returned every season. Predators came back every year. A human life carried no such guarantee. It is a compelling reading, and it is currently the closest thing this field has to a working theory. It is also, by Lewis Williams's own later admission, incomplete. It does not explain why the violence lands so consistently on the human figure specifically, rather than being spread more evenly across the art. It does not explain why artists at Trois Frères and Gabiou reached for hybrids instead of simply painting a wounded human, when a straightforward pierced body would have made much the same point. And it does not explain why the same specific avoidance shows up again, almost identically, in two different human species, separated by tens of thousands of years and an entire ocean of geography, as if something about picturing a human being at all touched a nerve that had nothing to do with any single culture's particular beliefs. That is the part keeping this from qualifying as a solved mystery, however satisfying the fragility theory sounds when you first hear it. Researchers can describe the pattern in exhaustive detail: what is missing, where it is missing from, and roughly what shows up in its place instead. What nobody working in this field can currently do, with any honest degree of certainty, is tell you why, or say what the artists themselves would have answered if it were somehow possible to ask them directly what a spear through a painted human chest was actually meant to communicate. It began with a handprint pressed into stone and dusted with ochre, a small, quiet claim: I was here. Decades of research still cannot fully explain why. When Paleolithic people finally tried to picture themselves directly, They reached for wounds, hybrids, and bodies caught mid-collapse instead. Never a hunter standing tall, never a family at rest. Maybe that was a statement about fragility, made by people who understood something about their own precariousness that they had no other way to record. Or maybe it was something else entirely, a piece of meaning that simply did not survive the tens of thousands of years between them and us, the same way almost everything else they ever said to each other never made it either. Both answers remain possible. Neither one is proven. What is left, every time torchlight lands on one of those rare human figures, is the same unresolved feeling archaeologists have been sitting with for over a century. The unmistakable sense that these people were trying to tell us something, and the honest admission that, after everything science has managed to date, measure, and cross-reference, we are still not entirely sure we are hearing it right.